You open your eyes and they are already watching you. Not hovering, not startled, watching, as if they knew the exact second your consciousness would return. The table beneath you is solid, the light above you is real. And what happens in the next few moments is the most documented and least discussed sequence in the entire history of abduction research. Nobody warns you about this part. Decades of testimony from witnesses on every continent converge on a single, specific moment. The moment an abductee regains awareness while the procedure is still underway. These are not vague impressions or half-remembered dreams. These are detailed, cross-referenced accounts that describe the same sequence of events in the same order, reported independently by people who never met and never compared notes. That is not coincidence. That is a protocol. And here is what makes this particular thread so difficult to dismiss once you start pulling on it. The procedure does not stop when you wake up. The beings in these accounts do not freeze, do not retreat, do not show any sign that your sudden consciousness has interrupted anything at all. Something shifts, but it is not what you would expect. And understanding exactly what that shift is will change the way you hear every abduction account you have ever encountered. The first time this specific moment was formally documented, it was 1957, and the witness was a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas. He did not report a blackout followed by a gap in memory. He reported waking up on a surface inside a craft while figures were still present and still active around him. He was aware, he was observing, and the beings in that room did not stop what they were doing. That detail, the continuation of activity after the witness regains consciousness, appeared in his account decades before researchers had any framework to categorize it. Then came Betty Andreasson in 1967. Under hypnotic regression conducted by investigator Raymond Fowler, Andreasson described a paralysis that did not lift when her eyes opened. She could see the room. She could see the figures moving around her. But her body remained locked in place, completely unresponsive to her own will. She described the paralysis not as unconsciousness, but as a kind of imposed stillness, as if the capacity for movement had simply been removed, the way you might mute a speaker without turning it off. Her mind was running, her body was not. That distinction matters enormously, because if this were simply a neurological artifact, a hypnagogic episode, a stress response, a feature of trauma memory, you would expect the paralysis to dissolve the moment full waking consciousness returned. That is how the body works. That is the standard physiological sequence. Andreasson's account does not follow that sequence. Neither do the dozens of cases that came after it. Bud Hopkins spent the better part of 3 decades cataloging what he called freeze accounts, instances where abductees reported full conscious awareness during an ongoing procedure combined with an inability to move or speak. Hopkins was meticulous. He was also skeptical by instinct, which made his conclusions harder to dismiss. By the time he published Intruders in 1987, he had documented case after case in which witnesses described the same essential experience. Eyes open, mind active, body immobile, and the figures in the room continuing their work without any visible reaction to the change in the witness's state. He noted something else, something that tends to get buried in the broader discussion of his research. The figures, the grays, did not ignore the awakening witness. They redirected. There is a difference, and Hopkins was precise about it. Ignoring implies no awareness of a change. Redirecting implies the change was registered and a response was chosen. In account after account, witnesses described a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable, where one or more of the beings shifted their attention toward the newly conscious abductee. Not to stop, not to retreat, to redirect. What that redirection looked like varied. Some witnesses described a figure moving closer and holding what felt like sustained eye contact. Others described a kind of stillness that passed over the room, brief and deliberate, before the activity resumed. A smaller number described something that felt like communication, not spoken, not gestured, but received. A sense of being told, without words, to remain calm, to wait, that everything was proceeding as it should. That last detail appears in enough independent accounts to be worth sitting with for a moment. These are witnesses from different countries, different decades, different cultural backgrounds, reporting through different investigators, using different methodologies. And a meaningful number of them describe the same response to their awakening. Not alarm, not concealment, but a kind of managed acknowledgement. A signal that says, "We know you are awake, and it does not change what happens next." Which raises the question that the rest of this investigation is built around. If the Greys register the moment a witness regains consciousness, and the evidence strongly suggests they do, then what exactly are they redirecting their attention toward? What is the specific action that follows the acknowledgement? Because across these accounts, there is a pattern in what comes next. A consistent, repeatable sequence that researchers like Hopkins, David Jacobs, and John Mack each documented from different angles without ever fully assembling into a single picture. That picture is what we are building here. And the next piece of it, the one that explains why the paralysis does not lift, why the procedure continues, and why so many witnesses describe leaving the experience with something they cannot quite name but cannot shake, that piece begins with what researchers call the compliance effect. David Jacobs, the Temple University historian who spent more than 3 decades documenting abduction testimony, describes a specific countermove the Greys make. The instant an abductee comes back online, they lean in. They apply direct ocular focus. And within seconds, the person is under again. Jacobs called it re-sedation through gaze. His interview subjects used almost identical language across hundreds of independent cases. A Grey steps close, tilts its head, and locks its enormous black eyes onto the abductee's eyes. The awareness that had just returned begins to slide backward. Thought slows, the room dims at the edges, and then the freeze reasserts itself, deeper than before. Now think about what that means procedurally. If the paralysis were only fear, only shock, only some primal freeze response of the human nervous system, no countermove would be necessary. The witness would simply lie there, terrified, until adrenaline burned out. But the Greys act. They intervene. They do something specific and repeatable the moment consciousness returns. Which tells you the freeze is not a byproduct of the encounter. The freeze is a state they are maintaining. Consider Travis Walton, taken in November 1975 outside Snowflake, Arizona, in front of 6 coworkers who watched him get struck by a beam of light and later passed polygraph examinations about what they saw. Walton described waking on a table with his mind fully clear. He could see, he could think, he could form the intention to move. But movement itself was impossible. His body would not answer his mind. The signal was there. The response was not. That distinction matters. Fear does not sever the link between intention and muscle. Fear floods the muscles. What Walton described, what Jacobs' witnesses described, what Betty Hill described back in 1961 is something closer to a clean electrical cut. Consciousness on one side of the wall, body on the other, and a technology, or a technique, holding the wall in place. The Roper organization confirmed the scale of it in 1992. Working with Bud Hopkins, John Mack, and David Jacobs, Roper conducted a nationwide survey of nearly 6,000 American adults, screening for a cluster of specific experiences associated with abduction. Among respondents who reported the core cluster, paralysis during a nighttime encounter was one of the most frequently cited elements. Not occasional, not rare, a majority. A majority of independent witnesses across every region of the country, most of whom had never spoken to another abductee, all describing the same imposed neurological state. That is not a folklore signal, that is a data signal, and it lines up with something Jacobs stressed in his clinical write-ups. The paralysis is not uniform in depth. It fluctuates. It can lift partially, it can lift fully, for seconds at a time before being reimposed, which is exactly what you would expect from an applied field or an applied technique rather than a chemical sedative. Chemicals fade on a curve. This behaves like a switch. So picture the sequence, the way the witnesses describe it. The freeze is imposed. The abductee is moved. The procedure begins. Somewhere in the middle, the switch slips. Awareness floods back. The abductee sees the room, sees the beings, sees the instruments. And in that narrow window, before the abductee can act on what they now know, a gray closes the distance, brings its face within inches, and applies the gaze. The switch resets. The compliance is restored. And then, and this is the part the older UFO literature almost never emphasized, the procedure does not restart. It resumes from exactly where it was interrupted, as if the interruption was an inconvenience, not an event. As if waking up mid-procedure is something they have handled thousands of times before and have a rehearsed response for. Which raises the question every serious researcher eventually arrives at. If they can re-sedate at will, if they can restore compliance in seconds, if the whole thing is that controlled, then what exactly are they doing during those procedures that requires such precise management of human awareness in the first place? What is worth the effort of holding a mind in place while the body is worked on? The answer, according to the witnesses themselves, is stranger than the abduction. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who staked his career on taking abduction testimony seriously, noticed something in his clinical interviews that other researchers had underweighted. When an abductee wakes mid-procedure and is then resedated, the instruments do not withdraw. The examination continues. The hands continue. The tools continue. Whatever the Greys are doing, they treat the interruption the way a surgeon treats a dropped sponge. A pause, not a stop. Mack documented dozens of these accounts through the 1990s at Cambridge Hospital, working with subjects who had never met each other and who arrived through independent referral channels. And across those interviews, a consistent shape emerged. The physical examination, the probes, the samples, the skin scrapings, the reproductive procedures Jacobs cataloged in such uncomfortable detail, that phase has a clear beginning. But it does not have a clean end. It changes character. Witnesses describe a transition. The instruments recede, the Greys step back from the table, or in some cases, step closer, and something else begins, something that does not involve tools, something that involves only the eyes, or only the proximity, or only what one of Mack's subjects called them looking through me instead of at me. That phrasing, looking through, not at, repeats across cases with almost no variation, and it is not the language of a person describing a medical exam. It is the language of a person describing an inspection of something interior. Consider what happened at the aerial school in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, in September 1994. 62 schoolchildren, on a break in the schoolyard, reported witnessing a craft land in the scrub beyond the fence, and small dark-eyed beings emerge from it. John Mack himself flew to Zimbabwe to interview the children personally, along with BBC journalist Tim Leach. The children were drawn separately. They were interviewed separately. Their accounts converged on details no coordinated hoax would produce. Among those details, one keeps surfacing in the transcripts. Several of the children describe the beings as looking inside them, not looking at them, inside them. One girl said the being's eyes went into her mind. Another said she felt the being reading her, the way you read a page. These were children between the ages of roughly 6 and 12. They did not have the vocabulary of adult abductees. They had not read Bud Hopkins. They had never heard of David Jacobs. And yet they arrived, in their own words, at the same description Mack was collecting from grown professionals in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The procedure shifts from physical to something harder to name. Carla Turner, before her death in 1996, cataloged this second phase in unusual detail. She observed that the physical examination, disturbing as it is, appears to be preparatory. It readies the abductee for what she called the informational exchange. And Turner was careful with that word. She did not say communication in the ordinary sense. She said exchange. Something moves in one direction, something moves in the other, and the abductee is the medium. Raymond Fowler, working with Betty Andreasen across a case file that eventually filled multiple books, reached the same conclusion by a different route. Fowler noted that Andreasen's most detailed and most consistent memories were not of the instruments. They were of what happened after the instruments. the section of the encounter that had no obvious medical purpose, the section where meaning, not tissue, seemed to be the object of study, which reframes the entire question of what an abduction actually is. If the physical procedure were the point, the beings would have no reason to linger past its completion. They would return the subject and disengage. But they do not disengage. They transition. They shift from working on the body to working with or through the mind. And that shift points to a purpose far larger than one body on one table on one night. Because whatever the Greys are extracting or delivering in that second phase, it is arriving in a form that human language, human neurology, and human communication should not be able to receive. And yet, the witnesses receive it, clearly, fully, word for word. Abductees, across decades and continents and languages, report the same impossible thing. Somewhere in the middle of the procedure, a Grey communicates with them directly. No mouth moves, no sound crosses the room. And yet a message arrives, fully formed, inside their own mind, in their own internal voice, in their own vocabulary, as if the thought had originated with them. Bud Hopkins called it the delivered thought. David Jacobs called it telepathic imposition. Whitley Strieber, describing his own 1,985 encounter in upstate New York, said the communication felt less like hearing and more like remembering something that had just been placed there. Raymond Fowler documented one of the clearest examples in the Andreasen case file. Betty Andreasen, interviewed under hypnosis and while fully awake, described extended nonverbal exchanges with the beings during her encounters that began in January 1967. She would ask a question in her mind. An answer would arrive. She would form a doubt. The doubt would be addressed before she had finished shaping it. Fowler noted that the exchange operated faster than speech. Full concepts moved in single beats. And Andreasen, a devout Christian with no background in occult or paranormal literature, had no framework at the time for what she was describing. She simply reported what happened. Then multiply that across the caseload. John Mack's Harvard subjects reported it. Jacobs Temple University subjects reported it. Hopkins, New York subjects reported it. The Ariel school children reported it. One of the girls, drawing what she had seen, told BBC interviewers the being had given her a message about the environment, about what people were doing to the earth. She was 11 years old. She had not been coached. Mack pressed her on the point. The message had arrived, she said, without words. That last detail is the one that breaks the mundane explanations, because a hallucination borrows from the mind that hosts it. A cultural script requires cultural exposure, but the Ariel children on a schoolyard in Zimbabwe produced the same phenomenon that a professor in Massachusetts and a housewife in Connecticut had produced independently. No mouth moved. The message arrived fully formed, and the content in every case felt authored, not generated by the witness, but delivered to them. Carla Turner pushed further than most researchers were willing to on the content itself. She noticed that the messages follow a pattern, not identical messages, but a shared architecture. There are recurring themes, warnings about the fate of the planet, statements about humanity's place in a larger order, references to a coming change, a coming convergence, a coming point at which what the abductee has been shown will matter. Turner was cautious about taking those messages at face value. She flagged, correctly, that a communication method you cannot verify is a communication method you cannot trust. The fact that a thought arrives fully formed does not make the thought true. It only makes it delivered. But whether the content is honest or strategic, the mechanism itself is the anomaly. Direct mind-to-mind transmission, mid-procedure, from a non-human intelligence received identically by witnesses who have never met. That is not a psychological artifact. That is a capability. And a capability that specific implies infrastructure. It implies design. It implies that the Greys are not simply examining human beings. They are addressing them, which changes the meaning of the entire encounter. The paralysis is not just crowd control. The resedation is not just convenience. The physical procedure is not the whole point. Everything that happens on that table, the freeze, the instruments, the gaze, the shift, is scaffolding. Scaffolding for a moment in which something is transmitted. Something the Greys want the abductee to carry back into ordinary life. Something they want deposited inside the population. And when you line up the transmitted content across decades of independent testimony, the P, once you see the pattern, it does not release you. The transmission is already inside you now. Comment your own encounter below and subscribe for the next revelation.